The sky above the Pacific was endless, blue, merciless, and vast enough to swallow 1,000 souls without leaving a trace. In that endless expanse, one man would become a legend, not because he sought glory, but because he could never turn away from duty. His name was Richard Bong, and he would go down in history as America's deadliest fighter ace. But he never saw himself that way. To Bong, every dogfight was not a contest of skill, but a desperate struggle to survive. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing home. He was born in the small town of Poplar, Wisconsin, a place so quiet that even the wind seemed to whisper through its pine trees with restraint. The world was still innocent then. Boys learned to shoot not for war, but for hunting season. Airplanes were distant shapes in the sky, something you watched, not something you mastered. Yet even there, far from the roar of engines and the smoke of battle, young Richard felt an irresistible pull toward the clouds. When he saw a plane, he didn't see a machine, he saw freedom. That feeling never left him. While others dreamed of cities and families, he dreamed of altitude. When America entered the war, Bong didn't hesitate. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, barely 21 years old. To his family, he was still the quiet farm boy who helped with chores and smiled awkwardly when praised. But beneath that calm exterior was a pilot's heart already beating faster than most. At Luke Field in Arizona, instructors noticed something unusual. Bong wasn't just good, he was instinctive. He didn't think in seconds, he felt them. His flying seemed almost intuitive, as if he could sense air currents before they touched his wings. He could loop, roll, and dive with a natural grace that other pilots had to fight for. But it wasn't showmanship. He never sought to impress. He simply wanted to understand the sky, to belong to it. His choice of aircraft would define him, the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter that looked like no other. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was sharp, predatory, built for speed and precision. Two engines meant power. Twin tails meant control. For Bong, it was a perfect match, a machine that could be both elegant and lethal. By the time he reached the Pacific, America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire dominated the skies and the seas, pushing across islands with unstoppable confidence. Morale was fragile. The world needed heroes, and Bong was about to become one, whether he wanted to or not. His first missions were over New Guinea, a place where humidity clung to skin and death could appear without warning. The jungle below was so thick that crashed planes disappeared forever, swallowed by green silence. Every sortie was a gamble between visibility and survival. Inexperienced pilots died quickly. Those who lasted more than a few weeks were veterans by default. Bong flew differently. He didn't rely on aggression, but patience. While others charged headlong into dogfights, he studied his enemies. He learned how the Japanese Zeros turned tighter but lost speed in dives. He understood how the sun could be both a weapon and a shield. He attacked from above, unseen, and struck with precision. In his first months, he downed several enemy aircraft, often saving his squad mates in the process. But each victory came with a price. One more memory burned into his conscience. He would return to base silent, rarely celebrating. When asked how he felt after a kill, Bong simply said, "I was lucky again." That humility became his signature. To others, he was a quiet ace. To himself, just a farm boy who happened to survive. As his record grew, so did the myth. Newspapers called him the Ace of Aces. His face appeared on posters. His smile became a symbol of American air power. But fame sat uneasily on his shoulders. He wrote letters home apologizing for the attention, insisting he wasn't special. The truth was, Bong wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting to make sure his friends came back alive. By 1944, his name was whispered with reverence in the Pacific. He had over 20 confirmed kills, then 30, then 40. Each one a life taken, each one another step further from who he used to be. His commanders wanted him to rest, but Bong refused. He said, "If the boys are still out there, I can't sit here doing nothing." He was no longer just a pilot. He was a guardian of the sky, one who carried both pride and guilt in equal measure. By the summer of 1944, Richard Bong had become a living legend. 40 victories in the sky, 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed. No other American pilot had ever reached such numbers, and few would ever come close. Every mission report, every telegram from the Pacific, carried his name like a quiet drumbeat of victory. But Bong never celebrated. For him, the numbers meant something darker. Every plane shot down was another pilot, another young man who would never return home. He had seen too many friends vanish in flames to believe in glory anymore. When asked how he became the best, Bong's answer was disarmingly simple. He said, "I just tried to stay alive." There was no arrogance, no excitement in his tone, only fatigue. He had mastered the art of survival, but survival in war is not peace. It's a slow erosion of who you are. He began to carry a small photograph in his cockpit, a picture of his fiancée, Marge. She became his anchor, his reminder that there was still a world beyond the gun sights. He painted her name on the nose of his P-38, Marge. That plane became more than a machine. It was his connection to humanity in a world built to destroy it. In the air, Bong was almost untouchable. He flew with precision so fine that fellow pilots joked he could thread bullets through a needle. He used the sun, clouds, and shadows as his allies. He fought with intellect more than aggression. Where others dove into combat blind, Bong always seemed to appear at the perfect angle, the perfect second. It was as if he could sense the rhythm of war itself. But even legends grow weary. As the battles dragged on, exhaustion began to settle in his eyes. He started to forget the count. The numbers blurred, meaningless. He wrote home less frequently, spoke less after missions. Commanders noticed the change. One described him as calm, too calm, like he's already seen the end. In July 1944, his tally reached 40 confirmed kills, an unmatched record that would never be surpassed during the war. For the American public, Bong was a hero. For the military, he was propaganda gold, the clean-faced boy from Wisconsin who humbled Japan's best pilots. They wanted him home, safe, to inspire others. But Bong resisted the idea of being pulled from combat. He believed his place was with his men. He told his commanding officer, "You don't ground the others for being lucky." But the truth was more complicated. He wasn't just lucky, he was haunted. Each time he looked at the clouds, he saw shapes, silhouettes of planes that were no longer there. The empty sky became a graveyard he couldn't escape. He started flying more cautiously, sometimes breaking away from fights to protect his wingmen rather than chase kills. His commanders noticed and quietly reassigned him to training duties, hoping to save him from himself. Back in the United States, Bong was greeted with parades, medals, and endless interviews. He received the Medal of Honor from General Douglas MacArthur himself, a moment that should have defined triumph. But photographs from that day tell another story. While MacArthur smiles proudly, Bong's eyes look distant, almost sad. He didn't belong on a stage. He belonged in the sky. He returned to his hometown briefly, a national hero walking the same dirt roads he'd once run as a boy. Neighbors waved, children pointed, bands played. But Bong could barely recognize the world around him. He was polite, gentle, grateful, but restless. Peace felt unfamiliar, like wearing someone else's uniform. At night, he would lie awake listening to the silence. It was too quiet. The absence of engines, gunfire, and radio chatter felt wrong. He confessed to a friend that the hardest part of war wasn't the fighting, it was learning how to stop. As the months passed, he was asked to tour factories, appear on radio shows, and promote war bonds. He smiled for cameras, but the effort drained him. He wasn't an actor, and fame was a battlefield of its own. Everywhere he went, people thanked him for killing. But he never saw himself as a killer. He was a pilot who did what he had to do. That distinction mattered to him.
In one rare interview, Bong said softly, "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted the war to end." Those words were barely printed. The editors preferred the headlines that called him the Japanese scourge. But the truth behind the smile was quieter, more human. He had done his duty, and it had changed him forever. The Air Force finally grounded him permanently, refusing to let its greatest ace risk his life any longer. For the first time since he'd taken to the skies, Bong had no mission, no enemy, no reason to fly. And yet, deep inside, the sky still called to him. Peace was supposed to be simple. The war was ending, the medals had been given, and America was already dreaming of the atomic age, a future of jets, power, and progress. But for Richard Bong, peace felt like exile. The sky was still out there, unclaimed, whispering through every gust of wind. He tried to settle down. He married Marge, the woman whose name had once flown across the Pacific painted on his fighter's nose. They smiled for photographs, newlyweds framed by hope.
To everyone around them, it looked like the perfect ending. The hero home at last, love triumphant over war. But Bong carried something invisible, the restlessness of men who'd lived too long on borrowed time. He began working as a test pilot for the Lockheed Corporation, helping to usher in the next generation of American aircraft. The world was moving from propellers to jets, and Bong, ever the pioneer, wanted to be part of it. It wasn't about combat anymore. It was about understanding the sky in its new form. The roar of engines had changed, but the silence between heartbeats in the cockpit remained the same. The aircraft he would test was unlike anything before it, the P-80 Shooting Star. It was America's first operational jet fighter, a machine that represented the future, sleek and fast, a symbol of post-war ambition. To Bong, it was the next step in humanity's endless race against gravity. He studied its mechanics, memorized its systems, and felt that same spark he had felt years before in training, the quiet thrill of discovery. But jets were unpredictable. Their engines were temperamental, their controls untested. Every flight was a risk, every takeoff a roll of the dice. For Bong, that danger was familiar, even comforting. He trusted his instincts more than the machine. Still, his friends noticed something different. He was quieter now, more distant. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. When reporters asked if he missed the war, he shook his head, but hesitated just a little too long. War, after all, had been his reality for so long that normal life felt like an illusion. He once told a colleague, "Flying is the only time I don't think about it." In 1945, as the war reached its final, terrible crescendo, the atomic bombs over Japan, the surrender of the empire, Bong was back in California, climbing into the cockpit of his P-80 for another test flight. The world was celebrating peace. He was chasing a different kind of silence. That morning, August 6, 1945, the sun rose over Burbank with the same calm indifference it always had. No one could have known that halfway across the Pacific, at that exact moment, the Enola Gay was flying toward Hiroshima with its deadly cargo, a new weapon that would end the war and redefine humanity. And here, on the other side of the world, America's greatest ace was preparing to fly what would be his last mission. The irony was haunting. While the most destructive force ever created was about to fall on Japan, the man who had fought the empire face to face was preparing to test the machine that symbolized the next generation of warfare. It was as if fate had written both stories on the same page. Bong took off smoothly that morning. Observers on the ground watched as the P-80 climbed into the bright California sky, its jet engine leaving a thin white trail behind. For a few minutes, everything was perfect. Steady altitude, clean turns, the sound of progress echoing through the air. Then, something went wrong. The engine sputtered, flames burst from the rear. The aircraft began to lose control. Witnesses later said Bong tried to eject, but too late. The jet plunged toward the ground and exploded on impact near North Hollywood. The wreckage burned fiercely, a twisted monument to the thin line between mastery and disaster. He was 24 years old. News reached his wife just hours later. While America celebrated victory in the Pacific, the radio carried another headline: America's top ace killed in jet crash. Two stories, both tragic in their own way, collided in history that day. The end of one war and the end of the man who had defined it. Those who knew Bong said it felt as though he had been claimed by the very sky that had made him. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, outflown the best pilots Japan had, and returned home unscathed, only to be taken by the thing he loved most. There was no enemy that day, no dogfight, no chaos, only silence. And in that silence, perhaps, Richard Bong finally found peace. The news of Richard Bong's death spread across America like a shadow over victory. It was August 1945, and the world was celebrating the end of the most devastating war in human history. Japan had surrendered. The guns had fallen silent. The streets of San Francisco and New York were alive with laughter, music, and the bright sound of peace finally returning. But in a small house in California, a widow held a telegram in her hands, her fingers trembling. While the nation rejoiced, Marge Bong wept quietly for the man who had given everything and received nothing in return but remembrance. Newspapers carried his photograph alongside the headlines of Japan's surrender. One showed the Enola Gay above a mushroom cloud. The other, Bong smiling beside his P-38. Two images, side by side, one of power, one of humanity. Together they told a story larger than any single man, that victory, even in triumph, always demands a price. To the public, Bong became a legend overnight. He was the ace of aces, the small-town boy who had single-handedly turned the tide of the Pacific Air War. Schools were named after him, monuments built in his honor. Hollywood wanted to make movies about him. His hometown of Poplar, Wisconsin, raised flags in every window. But those who had flown beside him remembered something different. They didn't speak of a killer or even a warrior. They spoke of a man who never forgot to check on the rookies after every mission. A man who would circle back over a burning plane to make sure someone had a chance to bail out. A man who, when asked how he became the best, said only, "I tried to make sure someone else didn't die today." That was the truth of Richard Bong. Not the medals, not the numbers, but the conscience that guided every choice he made in the air. Historians often measure war in statistics: sorties flown, kills confirmed, tonnage dropped. But statistics cannot capture a man's soul. And Bong's soul was heavy with contradiction. He was lethal yet gentle, celebrated yet uncomfortable with praise. He carried victory in one hand and guilt in the other. In time, his story began to fade from public memory. New wars came, new heroes took the stage. Jet pilots replaced propeller aces, and Bong's era became a chapter in history books. But among the older generation of aviators, his name remained sacred. They spoke of him not as a myth, but as a reminder that even in the most brutal conflict, decency can survive. One of his fellow pilots once said, "Bong made killing look effortless, but he never enjoyed it. That's what made him great." It was an insight few could understand, because in the world of war, greatness is often confused with brutality. But Bong proved that the highest form of mastery is restraint, the ability to destroy yet choose to protect. His wife, Marge, rarely spoke publicly after his death. She lived a quiet life, surrounded by his letters, photographs, and the fragments of a dream cut short. In one of those letters, written from New Guinea in 1943, Bong had said, "I don't know if I'm a hero, Marge. I just hope someday I'll be able to come home and forget the sound of engines." That sentence captures him better than any monument ever could. He didn't fight for fame. He fought so that one day the world could stop fighting. Years later, when jet technology matured and new generations of pilots took to the air, they did so in machines descended from the very aircraft Bong helped test. The shooting star became the father of American jet aviation, the dawn of a new age. In a way, Richard Bong's final flight wasn't an end. It was a beginning, the moment when humanity took one step closer to the edge of the future. But that progress came at the cost of the man who embodied the past. A man who believed that courage was not about domination, but about understanding what it means to take a life and still keep your humanity intact. Even decades later, veterans who had served under Bong would still lower their voices when his name was mentioned. To them, he was not a legend carved in marble. He was a friend, a leader, a man whose silence spoke louder than medals. And perhaps that's why his story endures. Because Richard Bong never tried to be remembered. He simply tried to do what was right, one flight at a time. War has a strange way of defining greatness. It measures it in victories, in numbers, in how efficiently one man can end another's life. It rewards those who kill the most, not those who think the hardest about what killing means. But Richard Bong never saw himself through that lens. For him, greatness wasn't about outscoring the enemy. It was about outlasting his own fear, about staying human in a world that demanded the opposite. Every time he flew into combat, he did what every soldier must do, silence the part of himself that questioned why. And yet, even in the chaos of battle, Bong never lost that voice completely. He knew that behind every enemy cockpit was someone else's son, someone else's dream. He fought because he had to, not because he wanted to. That is why, decades later, those who study his life say he represented not just skill, but conscience. In war, conscience is rare. It doesn't fit inside strategy briefings or after-action reports. It doesn't win medals. But it is what separates heroes from monsters. And Bong carried that conscience like a hidden weight, invisible to others, but heavy enough to shape everything he did. When he looked at the sky, he saw both beauty and burden. It was the place where he became immortal, and the place that took everything from him. The same wind that lifted his wings also whispered the names of the men who never came home. Perhaps that is why his story feels so human even now. Because beneath the myth, there was never a man who glorified war, only one who survived it, and never stopped questioning what survival meant. He lived in a time when the world wanted heroes made of steel, men who fit into propaganda posters and victory speeches. But Bong's strength was different. He was soft-spoken, reflective, humble. He didn't roar, he whispered, and yet that quietness became its own kind of power. Historians often compare him to other aces, names with higher kill counts, faster reflexes, louder reputations. But Bong's story endures not because of his 40 victories, but because of the way he carried them. Each one carefully placed in the ledger of his conscience. Each one remembered not as triumph, but as tragedy narrowly escaped. He was proof that even in war, especially in war, humanity still matters. That courage is not found in hatred, but in empathy. That the greatest pilots are not the ones who love fighting, but the ones who wish they didn't have to. In a letter written shortly before his death, Bong said, "When you've seen enough, you start to realize that war is a test no one really passes." That line was never published in newspapers. It was too quiet for the headlines, too uncomfortable for a nation that wanted victory without guilt. But it might be the most honest thing ever said by a man who lived through the fire. The paradox of Richard Bong is that he was the perfect warrior in a war he wished never existed. He represented the best of what America could produce: skill, courage, discipline, yet he also embodied its conscience, the awareness that even righteous wars leave scars that never fade. That awareness is what makes him timeless. It transforms his story from one of numbers and kills into one of reflection and morality. He reminds us that behind every medal there is a human cost. Behind every headline there is silence. His legacy isn't just written in flight logs or victory counts. It's written in the way he lived, and in the way he never allowed himself to forget the weight of what he'd done. In that sense, he was more than a pilot. He was a mirror for his generation. A reminder that courage without conscience is just chaos with wings. And when we look back at his life, at that boy from Wisconsin who dreamed of touching the clouds, we realize something simple yet profound. that true greatness doesn't roar with pride, it whispers with humility. Richard Bong never declared himself a hero. He never needed to, because real heroes don't chase immortality. They live by the quiet belief that doing what's right is enough. In the decades that followed, the world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. The propellers that once carried men like Richard Bong into battle gave way to the thunder of jet engines, then to rockets that pierced the edge of space. The sky, his home, his battlefield, his grave, became a new frontier for generations that would never know what it felt like to fight and die in it. And yet, even as time blurred the names of wars and the faces of soldiers, Bong's story refused to fade. Not because of his record or his medals, but because his story asked a question that every era must answer for itself. What does it mean to win a war? For some, victory is measured in territory. For others, in technology or strength. But Bong's life reminds us that victory without conscience is just another kind of loss. He won 40 battles, but he never let himself forget what those battles cost. He never let triumph drown out humanity. There's a small museum in Superior, Wisconsin, not far from where he was born. Inside, behind glass, sits the leather flight jacket he once wore, faded from sunlight and time. Next to it, a simple photograph, a young man smiling shyly beside his P-38 Marge. No hero's pose, no arrogance, just a boy who looked as if he still couldn't believe he'd made it that far. Visitors stop and stare, reading the plaque that calls him America's Ace of Aces. But what they remember isn't the title. It's the expression in his eyes, calm, distant, thoughtful. It's the face of a man who knew the difference between surviving and living. Every generation has its warriors, its legends, but most legends grow louder with time, exaggerated, polished, mythologized. Bong's legend does the opposite. It grows quieter. It hums beneath the noise of history like the low thrum of an engine far above the clouds, steady, patient, eternal. Perhaps that's how it should be, because Richard Bong's story was never about victory. It was about grace under impossible pressure, about remembering compassion in the middle of chaos, about understanding that even when the world demands you become a weapon, you can still choose to be human. He died the same day America proved its ultimate power, the day the atom split the world in half. While one explosion marked the end of an empire, another marked the end of a man who had fought it. One death brought peace through destruction, the other peace through sacrifice. It's impossible not to see the symbolism. Two moments born from the same sky, defining the two faces of war, progress and loss. And in that contrast lies the truth that Richard Bong embodied more than anyone. That the measure of greatness is not how much destruction one can cause, but how much humanity one can keep. When you read about him now, in a paragraph inside a textbook or a footnote on a museum wall, it's easy to miss the scale of what he represented. But think about it. A young man from a quiet town who flew into the deadliest skies of the century. Not for glory, not for hatred, but because someone had to. And when it was over, he came back to a world that no longer understood him. A world too eager to celebrate without remembering the cost. He never got to see what came next. He never saw the age of jets or the flags raised in his name. But maybe that's for the best. Because for Richard Bong, war was never about the machines. It was about the people who flew them. The ones who didn't come back, and the silent weight they left behind. In the end, he was a man who mastered the sky, but refused to let it master him. And when his own engine failed, when fire consumed the machine that carried him, perhaps he didn't fall. Perhaps he finally let go. Because for someone like Bong, the sky was never just a battlefield. It was the closest thing he had to peace. So when we remember him, when we hear the echo of distant engines or look up at the same endless blue he once called home, we're reminded of what real greatness looks like. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand recognition,
It simply endures, quietly, humbly, like the contrail of a P-38 disappearing into the sun. Greatness in war isn't about numbers, it's about conscience. And Richard Bong proved that even in a world built for destruction, a man with conscience could still touch the sky and leave it a little more human than he found it.